Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Ilhan Niaz as a guest speaker today. Dr. Ilhan Niaz is a professor of history at Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He has multiple publications to his credit, including The State During the British Raj, Imperial Governance in South Asia, 1700 to 1947, Empires, Cultures of Power and Governance in Eurasia, and others. His most recently published book is titled Downfall, Lessons for Our Final Century. He is presently working on his next book, New World Empires, Cultures of Power and Governance in the Americas, commissioned by Routledge. Our discussant for today's event is Ms. Aisha Khan. Ms. Khan has over 30 years of experience in the development sector. As founder and head of the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change in Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization, she works at the community and policy level to strengthen climate action by supporting inclusive practices that promote social, ecological, and democratic equity. She is currently serving as a convener of the Working Group on Climate Security at the Strategic Policy Planning Cell, National Security Division. I will now request Ambassador Dr. Raza Mohammed, President IPRI, to share his welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, Umar. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ms. Aisha and Dr. Ilhan. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to stand here and welcome distinguished scholars, writers, thinkers, I would say. और जब दुनिया आगे चलेगी तो कहेंगे philosophers, inshallah. Actually, they are going to talk to us on a very, very important thing. When we say downfall, we also should talk of the rise. When nations fall or nations rise, we cannot actually blame the nature or the God. It's man. हम हैं, हम rise पे लेके जाते हैं चीजों को, हम fall की तरफ लेके धकेलते हैं. Ms. Aisha will be talking in detail about the climate change, also the catastrophe which we are facing now, and this not end of the catastrophe, perhaps beginning of more devastating floods and climate change effects. And this is not happening today; it has been happening to us over the time. But every time we make so many committees, we have commissions, and they send the reports, and then we talk in the media. Sometimes we blame each other, and then the things die down, and then we wait for the next catastrophe to come up and wake us up again. Wake us up again. When it comes to the nations, the United States, and I would say Dr. Ilhan should also focus more specifically on Pakistan itself, that what are the lessons which can carry us forward. And you people who are there sitting there at the back, especially the young ones, are the ones who have to learn from the mistakes of the present older generation. With this short welcome, I once again say thank you to you on behalf of the IPRI that you people could spare time, come here and share your views. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I will now request Dr. Ilhan Niaz to deliver his lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for that very kind welcome, and thank you to the entire team at IPRI for reaching out to me and for bringing me here. It's a Monday morning, so people tend to be a little cranky today anyway, and I'm afraid what I have to say to you might make you crankier still. But it is an occupational hazard as a historian, so we should just get into it. In my discipline, there has always been a considerable element of speculation about two things, and they are somewhat interrelated. One is that is there any ultimate outcome to which human progress or human development or growth is headed towards? And the second is that within that process, are there any patterns that are detectable that we can perhaps learn from if we study the past? So in this context, there have been different ideas about how history might reach a culmination point. If you think about Marxism, which was a very powerful vision for how history might reach a culmination point, the idea was that there would be a struggle between the haves and the have-nots through various stages in history. And in the end, the have-nots would be victorious and the world would transform itself into an advanced, industrialized, scientific utopia. Other people, like Francis Fukuyama, gave a different vision for an ultimate end towards history was advancing. And they argued that with the triumph of the United States and its allies in the Cold War, the combination of free market economies and liberal democratic political systems represented a final point of human ideological evolution. So thereafter, there would, of course, still be history in the ordinary sense of the term, in terms of events, wars, struggles, and other such things. But history as a debate between ideas, as a debate between ideological or philosophical systems, had effectively ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The rest of what we would experience as history would be simply the gradual overcoming of the rest by this vision of liberal democracy and free markets. So we have different ideas, and there is, of course, no definitive answer to any of these questions. But I would argue that in many ways, we now can actually project the likely end of our historical story. And that likely end is likely to transpire within the lifetimes of many who are sitting in this room. Some of us are older and will have perhaps the good fortune of having checked out by then, but others will perhaps hang around longer. And that end is that the basic process of industrial and economic development, the models that we have pursued, they have led to the collapse of the ability of our planet to sustain life. And that collapse has crossed vital tipping points. And those tipping points are now producing unpredictable and unwholesome consequences. Rather than addressing the causes, the underlying causes, we are distracted by other things. So if we think about just the last month or so, there has been a record-breaking drought in France, the worst drought since, I think, 1958. There has been a severe tropical storm in Puerto Rico, leaving that island without electricity or functioning utilities. Pakistan itself has suffered once in a century, perhaps, scale flooding. But now once in a century events are happening once every 7, 8, 10 years. And Italy and Japan have also recently suffered from severe weather-related, climate-related setbacks. But during the same time period, what is it that the global media has been covering? If you switch on CNN or you switch on BBC for the last, let's say, week, 10 days, 2 weeks, 80% of the coverage is about the succession of a new British monarch, about who is going to be what in the royal family. And of course, none of that matters to what is actually happening in the rest of the world. So we're sort of in a situation where we are fixated at a global level on things that might look very shiny, but are in fact immaterial to our future prospects. Within Pakistan, of course, our media is also fixated on certain things. Mostly it is fixated on the latest political gaffe committed by one of the endless number of cartoons that we have in different parts of the government and opposition. It is fixated on various political changes that are taking place or expected to take place. And the focus is again not on the things which actually matter in terms of Pakistan's long-term ability to survive. Indeed, that does not appear to be a consideration that our political elite or our chattering classes are really interested in contemplating. Now, what makes this analysis somewhat depressing is that it is not something which has struck us by surprise. Since the 1970s and 1980s, scientists have been warning us that there are limits to our growth model, that there are limits to how much we can push our ecosystem before it starts to break down and push civilization back. These predictions have been made in research journals. They've, of course, been made in the media. They've been made in documentary format. And there is a near scientific consensus that human activity is, in fact, the primary cause of the ecological breakdown that is now transpiring. But at the same time, what we see is that though the causes are understood and the solutions to those causes are also known, there is a lack of will to do anything about it. So it's not a question of a meteorite suddenly appears out of nowhere and obliterates life on Earth. What could we do about that? It is more of a question of a very slow-moving catastrophe in terms of human lifespan and perception. And that slow-moving catastrophe has been unfolding over several generations. And each generation, when it is in a position of authority to actually do something about it, rather than taking the measures that are necessary, simply adopts rhetorical positions and lets business as usual continue, thinking that maybe there is some kind of a solution down the corner that will address this problem without us actually having to change our behavior. So downfall itself is an attempt to explain this failure. That is, why is it that in spite of knowing what's coming our way, in spite of understanding how it is coming our way, and in spite of having the technical ability to do something about it before it actually hits us with the severity that it is now hitting us, why is it that we were not able to take actions? And why is it that even now, when we are in fact in the midst of a climate breakdown scenario, we are still not willing to do what is necessary in order to make it past the year 2100? So the essays in Downfall attempt to address this problem. And the first aspect of this problem is, of course, our biological and our psychological conditioning. The fact that human beings are generally wired pretty effectively to deal with short-term threats, to deal with immediate threats. Our xenophobic and our cooperative responses get triggered by threats that we can clearly identify as threats to our individual person, our individual safety, our individual security. But at the same time, our alarm system, if you will, is very poorly rigged for understanding threats that are unfolding at a relatively slow pace. I use the term relatively because it is using the human lifespan as an index. In fact, the scale is perhaps not actually that slow if you take an environmental or a geological time scale to it, But for our perception, the problem is that the event is taking place or the development is taking place at a very, very slow, at a very, very incremental rate. The immediacy of that threat also is something that is unevenly distributed. So not everybody faces that threat at the same time. We can see this in Pakistan as well, that much of the country seems to have just sort of shrugged off what is happening in the floods and carrying on with business as usual. And this is something, of course, which is also happening at a global scale. So we don't react to abstract threats. This is a basic problem over here in our essential conditioning. It is very hard for us to identify them as a threat and to do anything for them. The second aspect of this is that whether you are a Marxist or a neoliberal, whether you are an advocate of sustainable development or human development, whether you are aware of it or not, you are part of the same cult of infinite economic growth that argues that it is possible for human societies to become infinitely wealthier on a finite planet. So there has been a lot of debate over the last century, especially, about what is the best way to organize ourselves in order to become all like Switzerland or Denmark. And there have been different routes that societies have adopted to achieve that end. But what has generally been the assumption is that we can simply go on growing the GDP, growing the total output of goods and services, and increasing human consumption, especially consumption of resources and energy, and somehow or the other, things will work out for the best. Governments promise their people an improved standard of living. So even today in the United States, the American president is not really willing to frame the climate issue as an ecological issue, but he wants to frame it as a jobs issue, which is absurd because even if you go for a Green New Deal, that still ends up increasing the total energy footprint over the next 50 years or so. So the problem that we have over here is that all of our leaders, most of our thinkers, are enthralled to this idea that we can simply go on increasing the size of the world economy. Now, the tragedy over here is that the world economy is actually large enough and has been large enough to support every single human being on Earth at a decent standard of living for at least 20 years or so. So way back in 2000, the average global GDP was roughly $8,500 per capita. And of course, $8,500 per capita does not sound much if you think of the GDP per capita of Switzerland or Denmark, but it is actually a lot of money. It is more than enough money to create societies where everybody has access to good quality education, healthcare, and housing, and a chance to lead a meaningful life. But the focus has been on growing the size of the pie rather than redistributing the pie, because those societies that have very high levels of per capita income don't want to give up that $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 per capita income so that people in South Asia or Africa or other parts in the world can be raised to a decent middle income level. So the people who are in South Asia or Africa or other countries are urged that, well, you need to grow your economy, and we'll also continue to grow our economy, and that growth will gradually lift all of the boats. So this has been something which has prevailed all across our thinking. And in this, no one, at least not in mainstream economics, has seriously address the problem of how do we account for the resulting depletion of our natural environment. In fact, the most recent, one of the more recent Nobel Prizes in economics went to William Nordhaus for his prediction that, well, even a plus 4%, 4-degree increase in the world's temperature will not lead to a significant decrease in the global GDP or economic output, which again is something which is inconsistent with the laws of physics. The third problem that we face is that our political systems, our decision makers, are not selected through a system that actually rewards anybody for making long-term decisions. So political competition, whether we are thinking about a democracy or an autocracy or some mixture of the two, is in many ways a race to the bottom in which the least suitable candidates, the ones that are most willing to inflict short-term harm and long-term harm in exchange for immediate political gain, are likely to be rewarded. So different societies are trapped in their respective political cycles. And those political cycles, in some cases, like in the United States, for instance, operate in 2-year cycles. In other societies, maybe in slightly longer ones. But essentially what it does is that the goal of people who are in government is to somehow stay in government. And in order to stay in government, they are more than willing to compromise with precisely those elements in the society that are responsible for most of the environmental damage. So that locks us into a system whereby change in government or change in regime, as the case might be, does not alter our basic framework of bad decision making. Now, alongside this bad decision making, there is a fourth problem that we face. And that problem is that of optimism. Yesterday, Dawn carried an excerpt of one of the essays in my book. So they took the essay on optimism, the Pangloss effect, for their excerpts. And this is a problem which basically leads us to believe that our ability to continue as we are now continuing is somehow greater than the likelihood of that structure that sustains us being disrupted. So, in a way, we are all material optimists, especially since 1945, that everybody believes or wants to believe that their life will continue to get better, their consumption will continue to increase, their opportunities will continue to proliferate, but somehow the system, the life support system that is supposed to sustain all of this extraction and consumption is going to miraculously continue without us taking care of it. So optimism is a very, very serious problem that we face, because what it does is that it leads us to underestimate the risks to the planet that are now unfolding. Now, within this optimism, there are, of course, different elements, but one element in particular is very important. The last 40 years or so have seen global inequality increase dramatically. In fact, global inequality today within societies is at approximately the same level as it was on the eve of the First World War. That global inequality has created a very interesting nexus between third world elites and metropolitan elites. So over the last 40 years or so, life for the top, let us say 1 to 5% of the population in developing countries has actually gotten dramatically better, dramatically more interconnected. Whereas within advanced societies, again, life for the top 1 to 2% has gotten far, far better. The result of this is that in both the developed countries and the less developed countries, elites don't really think of themselves as being vulnerable to the catastrophe that is unfolding. They feel that, yes, this catastrophe is unfolding, but it is unfolding on other people. It is unfolding upon surplus human beings who are, for whatever reason, at the receiving end of this terrible tragedy. And the problem over here is that it is very hard to convince people whose own lives and prospects have improved under the variant of neoliberal globalization, that the improvement of your livelihood and your opportunities is actually generating a catastrophic bill for the whole of the human race. So the 1% wealthiest human beings, the top 75 million, generate as much greenhouse gas emissions as the poorest 4 billion human beings. That top 1% is doing great. And it is that top 1% that thinks that, well, we can somehow continue on this infinite growth trajectory. Of course, that is not likely to continue for much longer. Then, of course, we have a problem in a sense that the way our geopolitics have traditionally played out is that in times of scarcity, international cooperation or cooperation between societies is likely to diminish and conflict is likely to increase. So whatever architecture there is of international cooperation, like the United Nations or various other international organizations that deal with climate or the environment, they are operating on a very, very marginal level compared to what is happening. People who are actually running powerful states don't accept the legitimacy of responding to the climate crisis the way they would perhaps respond to a crisis of politics or military security. So to give you just one example of this, between 2001 and 2019, the United States of America spent something like $6 trillion US dollars on additional military appropriations for financing its wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. That's a lot of money. That's about hundreds of times the size of Pakistan's GDP. But during that same period of time, the United States of America spent a total of about 100 to 140 billion US dollars on climate science and responding to climate change. So you can see the gap in terms of the seriousness of the threat perceived by people in power and the actual response in terms of the budgetary and resource allocations. Even today, American elites are talking about a new Cold War with China. So you can almost see the Pentagon and the old Cold Warriors coming out and, gnashing their teeth at the prospect of another round of Cold War competition that, of course, will mean lots more money for heavy armaments and aircraft carriers and hypersonic weapons and God knows what else they will dream up. So our propensity towards geopolitical conflict is something that state elites are hardwired into. It is very hard to explain to state elites, whether in the United States or I suspect anywhere else in the world, that the actual imminent threat now to your national survival is not China, is not anybody else. It is the likelihood of environmental breakdown. So if the United States or other powers wish to respond to a crisis, they should respond to that crisis that is likely to actually lead to their destruction, not this imaginary crisis or other kind of crisis that they are likely to have with reference to the Chinese or any other geopolitical threat. The sixth issue, of course, is the problem of a high-level equilibrium. History teaches us that what goes up must come down. But the problem is that if you are on the upward path, it is very hard to perceive yourself in terms of whether you are plateauing and then starting to head downwards. In fact, what history teaches us is that tipping points, once they are crossed, whether they are of a political nature or an economic nature, or at present of an environmental nature, can actually lead to a rapid collapse of a high-level equilibrium. So you're going strong, you're going great, and then all of a sudden, by all of a sudden I mean within a period of maybe a generation or so, everything falls apart. When you are actually a part of that dominant structure, it is very difficult to imagine things falling apart. So there is this inbuilt conceit that we like to perhaps imagine that what is going to, or what has happened in history to so many others, is somehow not going to happen to us. That, somehow we have taken a special sort of, immunization, and we are somehow immune to this process of decline and fall. And then finally, there are the limits of our different governance models. So let us say today the world's leaders decide that yes, this is the number one problem, and yes, we need to do something about it, and let's go about actually trying to bring about a shift in how we organize ourselves in order to avoid the worst case scenario and maybe even gradually heal the planet for future generations. All of that requires machinery, administrative machinery, political machinery, military machinery, to translate that good intention into effect. But as a student of bureaucracy and governance, I can tell you that the fundamental problem or the fundamental quality of all bureaucracies is inertia. They don't like change. They don't like to do things differently. So even if a very wise and benevolent leader comes to power and all of our, let's say, let's say the world decides to appoint Jacinda Ardern as dictator of Earth for 5 years, she'll still have to instrument her policies through existing administrative structures. And those existing structures are not amenable to the kind of rapid shift and decision-making that we now require. So that dimension is also something which has to be factored in, that even if we all agree on what the problem is and decide today to implement a solution, the people that are going to be doing the implementing are essentially not perhaps ideally suited to that particular role. So at this stage, my unfortunate conclusion is, or hypothesis is, that downfall is inevitable. We can debate about when it will happen precisely, and we can, of course, debate about how it will happen. And we can also debate about who it will happen to first. Definitely people in the global north would prefer it to happen to, Pakistan and India first, and then baad mein wo khud hi apne aap ko dekh lenge. But the problem is that at this stage, we are all passengers on the Titanic. The iceberg is dead ahead. So if we don't correct course, it is the iceberg that is going to win, not the Titanic. If on the Titanic, we're busy arguing about where to, the proper arrangement of the deck chairs, then that's not really going to help us very much going forward. So with that, I'll stop my comments and I'll hand over to Ambassador Saab. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ilhan Niaz, for your informative discourse. I will now request Ms. Aisha Khan to share her views on the topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to IPRI for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's a privilege to share this conversational space with Dr. Ilhan Niaz, a scholar for whom I have great respect and regard. I mentioned in the book that talked about failure to learn from political dysfunction. So I will see how these feed into impacts of climate change that we are facing and what we are. Then what is it that I think since he mentioned about memory issues in learning, I will start with the most recent event in just although, mind you, last year when temperatures shot up, international media was talking about it, and it can connect the dots to say what can it be? What does the survivability mean? What does out-migration mean? With regard to that, I will also point out to a 2018 report that was brought out by the World Bank, and it was titled Climate Hotspots. It identified 4 districts in Sindh and 6 in Punjab to say that by 2040, they will become uninhabitable. But there's nothing that we're doing about it. We call ourselves sometimes or the 8th or the 10th most vulnerable country, but again, after saying that, there's no homework that we do to say, where is the vulnerability going to happen? What are the challenges that we face? What is the adaptation that we need? So building on that, I think that as an informed audience, all of you know that climate change affects food, water, energy, disasters, and livelihoods. So just a few words on each one of these, because I don't want to dwell too much on the technical aspects of this sectoral impact. But when it comes to food, I think we've used up all the land we have in the country. As it is, 96% of the soil in Pakistan never had the full organic spectrum for optimal agriculture, and yet we've always called ourselves an agricultural country. Insecurity, and 18% are facing acute food insecurity. When it comes to water, I think you all know that we get it from a transboundary source. The flow of water has not changed, but the per capita has changed. And that has largely to do with our population, the unsustainable population growth rate.
Then we talk about energy. We derive 80% from fossil fuel, and we have indicated in the nationally determined contributions, which is part of the Paris Agreement, that we are going to transition to 60% renewables by 2030. How we're going to do that, there is no roadmap for that. Disasters, yes, they have been happening and they will continue to happen with recurring frequency, because global warming means the temperature increasing. Increasing temperature means accelerated melting of snow. And we live in a vast understand the mass balance, the behavior, changing patterns of the cryosphere, what's going to happen when the permafrost melts too fast, what is the level of methane injection into the atmosphere and its impact. So all these things are going to come together. Now, look at some of the statistical issues that we have within the country. We are a population of 250 million people. How are we going to feed them? How are we going to give them water? We've never reflected on that as we keep growing. And by 2040, at this rate, we will be probably 400 million people. We will probably have less water, not due to any upper riparian action, but simply because in the next 20 years, there'll be more accelerated melting. We will have hydrometeorological disasters, and then there'll be scarcity of water at source. We will have perhaps 30 or 40% less water coming into the Indus, which is our lifeline. So we have a host of problems that we need to address. So I think, coming from where Dr. Ilhan Niaz is talking about, it's a very, very grim scenario. There's the global north and the global south pitted against each other. I think essentially it's all about grab of resources. It is about numbers. It is about who can manage better with what they have. So the global north will be in Ilhan mentioned the drought in Europe, the heat waves in North America, the wildfires all over the globe. This means that the global north is now actually facing the impacts of climate change. Earlier, it was only us and the small island development states or other least developing countries that were facing the issue. So they thought that, in maybe the next 20, 30 years, they will come up with that kind of technologies that will help them absorb the existing emissions and sequester more carbon. So they will somehow be safe. And they may still somehow be safe because 20 or 30 years down the road, we don't know what's really going to happen. Climate science is not an exact science. There's so many variations in it because what is happening today, right now, was so what will happen tomorrow to us, we really don't know. But our level of preparedness, unfortunately, is very poor. And that is where all these issues that Dr. Ilhan mentioned come into play. What is the model of governance we have? What will be the future model of governance that will work? Will it be democracy? Will it be challenged by populism? Will it be a takeover by authoritarian states? Because that may be the only answer eventually to impose the kind of discipline and take the hard decisions that you need to take. The role of the military in the forefront, increasing every day in terms of globally, is going to go up. And in our country, we have seen they're always in the front line to manage disasters. So this role might increase also. The role of civil society, I think with the kind of human capital we have, we can't expect much positive input. We have a large youth cohort, and youth is a very dynamic power. It is a very energetic power, but it can also be a very disruptive power. And that makes it very dangerous because when you have 60% less than 30 years of age who are going to go into a future without understanding of science and technology. very good leadership to emerge that can understand the problems at the national level, at the regional level, and at the international level. So these are the problems that we are going to face. And we as a nation are not prepared for them. Dr. Ilhan, I think, has very rightly pointed out that we like to have delusional aspirations. We like to think of ourselves as a country that can cope with everything that comes our way because we have ability in our faith that will help us to cross barriers. But there is need for capital, there is need for technology, and there is need for a policy, a sustained policy that you need to take forward. Every government that comes dismantling policies of previous governments and then building from start. We need to have a policy for adaptation, and we need to make sure that because it is security and then it becomes a matter of national security, how are we going to make progress on this? So as a nation, I think there is need for a greater realization of how badly this can affect us and how quickly it can take us down. Every nation has its own absorptive capacity. And when you reach the end of that capacity, then you are getting closer and closer to your tipping points. Dr. Ilhan has referred to the crisis slide, and I think we are very deep down on that crisis slide, from where return may become very, very difficult for us. So there is time, there is still time for us to take stock of where we stand. We find an easy way out always to blame somebody else for our own problems. But I think that this is time for introspection. This is time for reflection as well. And recognizing your own weaknesses is a form of strength. We need to see what is it that we did that has made us so vulnerable. What is it that we could have done differently to be a little more resilient today? And that means national policies, it means governance models, it means regional policies, and it means our international relations. And if we do want to become a middle income or an upper middle income country, what is the new trajectory that we need to follow? Because definitely without alternative pathways to development, we will not be able to change direction. So there has to be this willingness to change and say we need to do things differently. So these are, some of the issues that we are facing, and the rest, I think, in the Q&A session, we can address them. But for now, Dr. Ilhan, I really wanted to ask you that democracy as a model, as it's practiced today, seems to be failing everywhere in the world. Whether you look at the US or whether you see populist movements coming up in the world, how do you see the future? Do you see it leaning more towards controlled democracy, more authoritarian, or within the system of democracy, what is it that needs to be done differently to make it inclusive, to make it people-centered, to protect rights, and yet be able to handle the crisis that we are facing?
Thank you. Regarding forms of government and how they respond to crises, I think what we generally see is that any kind of government can do a bad job of responding to a crisis, and any kind of government can do a good job of responding to a crisis. At a purely theoretical level, you can argue both ways. For example, if you are in favor of, let's say you have an ideological preference for democracy, you can always make the case that, well, yes, democratic states might be slow to act, but within democracies, because you have such a large scope for social and political mobilization, it is possible for that popular pressure to eventually get translated into meaningful environmental policy. You can also make the reverse argument that, well, given the way in which we will have to deal with this crisis, the kind of discipline that is required can only be imposed by some kind of an enlightened, environmentally minded authoritarian regime that essentially puts the securing of the environment before what we would commonly consider to be people's aspirations for economic or political rights or representation. Of course, historically, what we are seeing is that the world's leading democracies are not able to actually think beyond their political cycles. And their leaders are faced with what might well be an impossible political choice. So, if you are, let's say, the president of France or the president of the United States or a leader in these types of societies, how do you basically tell your people that the only way to save the planet is to impose potentially indefinite restrictions on the type of consumption, waste, and other things that you basically have taken for granted for the past several generations? And that is a problem which no democratically elected political leader can possibly have the political courage to actually tell his people. There are exceptions to this, of course, but in general, it would be almost impossible to envisage such a scenario. On the other hand, if you think about various dictatorial regimes might also not do a really better job, because if you can, let us say, suppress information about climate breakdown or local climate catastrophes within your own society, you can perhaps manage that breakdown without harming the ruling elite. So there is no good way about it. So the lack of responsiveness of both authoritarian as well as democratic political systems to this problem is what actually I find alarming, that no one seems to be doing that kind of long-term thinking, and no one seems to be willing to, make those very difficult decisions. So this is something that, let us say that we have, in a way, perhaps reached the limits of what is possible through our normal processes of politics, whether democratic or authoritarian.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask one more question, and then, I will leave it for the chair to open the floor for questions. You mentioned, the elite capture in the world of resources. You also mentioned about, moral responsibility. So it makes me wonder that when we take that stance within Pakistan, also, I think if you look at it purely from the climate or environmental perspective, it is the elite that is the cause of degradation, because they are consuming the resources and they are responsible for the emissions, and it's the other half that is actually paying the prices. I don't see, the people who are suffering in Sindh or Balochistan right now as having done anything to have deserved this. So how is it that, we correct this within our own country first before we have a stronger moral case that we take to international platforms, accusing them of the same?
I think that elites that are far more intellectually serious than ours have not been able to grapple with this particular problem, even when their own countries had been faced with terrible calamities. So if you are, let's say, Pakistani or Indian or from another developing country, how do you convince, let us say, the United States to take environmental crisis seriously in your country when it does not seem to care so much about what happens in Puerto Rico. So I think this is again a fundamental constraint that we are now running into, that the way that our societies are organized, they are basically organized on the assumption that the environment will remain more or less stable and we'll be able to go on extracting from it. And now that those assumptions in both cases are no longer tenable, all of our ways of organizing our societies are in jeopardy. So when it comes to within Pakistan, of course, I think that a big problem, at least what I have seen, is that there is a reluctance amongst Pakistani elites to perhaps do what is necessary within their own country, what is within their power to do by way of adaptation. But at the same time, there also seems to be somewhat of a reluctance to effectively try and coordinate with movements within the West that are trying to put pressure on Western governments to effectively do something about the prospect of climate change. So there is a lot more than that we can do, but there is also a sense that I think, which is genuine, that there is in fact a grave injustice that is at play over here. And that is that however bad or disorganized Pakistan or other countries like us might be, the fact is that they have not actually contributed that much to the current mess that we are seeing. How they respond to that mess, of course, within their own borders, that can always be better. But many of those same countries are unable to free up resources to, do anything about these problems because they are very heavily in debt to the same countries that are producing most of the greenhouse gas emissions. So in Pakistan, whatever debate there is amongst the elite, it is about macroeconomic stability. I mean, I've, at least been aware of what's been going on in Pakistan since 1998. And I think that has been the running concern of all governments, whether civil or military or otherwise, that how do we achieve macroeconomic stability? And uska jo ek, typical format hai, wo yahi hota hai, that you go to the IMF and you try to manage things for a little while, and then you exit the program, and then you go back to the IMF. So that crisis that we face seems to consume all of our energy, all of our attention. So yes, I think a case can be made for debt relief. If not relief, then certainly a generous rescheduling of the bilateral or maybe even multilateral debts. Because how else is a society like Pakistan going to free up the resources to deal with climate adaptation? The other thing, of course, is that we need to be maybe a bit more specific about what exactly will climate adaptation entail in terms of economic cost. So there are different estimates just pouring in about the damage done by the floods. And obviously, those estimates will eventually be revised after a detailed survey can be conducted. But even at a conservative estimate, they are likely to run into the tens of billions of dollars, maybe in the range of 10 to 20% of Pakistan's GDP. So if every 10 years, Pakistan has to cough up 10 to 20% of its GDP to deal with catastrophic flooding, how are we going to manage that additional expenditure? It is obviously beyond the resource mobilization capacity of Pakistan.
Thank you. आप मुझे टेम्प्ट कर दिया अपने जवाब से कि मैं एक और सवाल चेयर की परमिशन से आपसे पूछ लूं कि देखिए क्लाइमेट चेंज का सिलसिला तो अभी रिसेंट फिनोमेना हमारे लिए पाकिस्तान में है, लेकिन अगर आप देखें कि 1947 से अब तक हम 22 दफा तो IMF जा चुके हैं। ये हम क्लाइमेट चेंज की वजह से तो नहीं गए। हमने 2010 के फ्लड से क्या सीखा, और अभी भी जो हम बात करते हैं फ्लड्स की, ये हमारे पास एडिशनल बर्डन जरूर है, मैं आपके साथ इत्तेफाक करती हूँ, लेकिन क्या ये हमारी एग्जिस्टिंग स्ट्रक्चरल इनइक्वालिटीज और इनएडिक्वेसीज जो सिस्टम में पहले से मौजूद हैं उनको नहीं एक्सपोज कर रहा कि देयर इज प्लेंटी दैट्स ऑलरेडी रॉन्ग विद अस? अगर ये क्लाइमेट चेंज ना भी हो रहा होता तो क्या आपका ख्याल है कि हम इस वक्त एक बेहतर जगह पे खड़े हुए होते? दैट्स माय लास्ट.
I think that there's a famous comic called Ziggy, and in it, one of Ziggy's comments is that he's telling a friend of his that don't worry, life is never so bad that it can't get worse. So yes, things here were bad before, and they were bad largely for our own internal mismanagement, our own non-seriousness. And now on top of that, we now have a situation that is basically unleashing, nation-killing levels of climate upheaval for which we are not historically responsible and against which we need to prepare to deal, largely with the thinking in mind that we have to deal with this problem on our own. So I am actually in favor of that, if we are going to deal with this, we need to figure out a way of dealing with this largely on our own. And that requires our, elite in general to stop focusing on the things that they like to focus on day and night and start having serious conversations about the future of this country and its place in the world. And I just don't see that happening. So, it's a sort of compounding of an underlying problem. And this is something which we will have to figure out how to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Aisha, for your remarks as well as your questions. We now move on to the Q&A session. We'll open the floor. The audience members are requested to please identify yourself, the organization you're associated with, and due to the paucity of time, if you could please keep your comments or questions short. Yes, please. If you could get the mic here, please.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Farha from the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research. Thank you so much for the lecture and for the good discussion. My question is in continuation with the discussion and also a comment made during the lecture. Dr. Sarvaji mentioned that the third world elite more from the current economic growth as compared to the regional rest of the world. So if the life is so better for them, then how, as the book suggests, would it be easier for the global south towards manage degrowth as compared to the global north? Thank you.
Well, the first thing is that I'm not sure that it would be easier for them to move towards anything other than what they are now doing. And that has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of the elites in developing countries are too closely interconnected with the metropolitan system of organizing the world economy. So their equities, let us say, are distributed not just in their own countries, but also in countries that are primarily responsible for the crisis that we are now facing. So I don't think that elites in the developing world actually have that immediate interest, let us say, to move away from this model of extraction. The other problem, of course, is that a lot of these same elites are dependent upon the Western world for their ideas about how to organize their economies in particular. So there is a kind of what we call ideological hegemony, let us say, of neoliberal ideas or neoliberal thinking. And this is shared by developing world elites to a remarkable extent. In fact, I would argue that actually developing world elites are better neoliberals in many cases than the Western elites that have come up with this idea in the first place. Because within Western societies, their state capacity, taxation capacity, regulatory capacity is far more developed. Whereas in general, in developing countries, the local elites are extremely hostile to any improvement in the taxation, regulatory, or redistributive capacity of their states. So in many ways, Friedman's ideal of a low taxing night watchman state that only takes care of a few basic things and leaves everything else to the operation of the market is actually realized in developing countries like ours, where, even if you want water, you have to buy it from the free market. So that is, I think, something which is unfortunate, but it is something which means that the elites that are presiding over the societies that stand to lose the most in the first instance of climate breakdown are not likely to do very much about it. So I don't think you're likely to see them coming up with any, let's say, new or improved ideas or alternative frameworks, even if perhaps they think along these lines. They have too much of a vested interest, in a sense, to change the way the world is structured, because the world works for them, even if it does not work for the rest of the people that are living in their society. It works for them, and they have gotten phenomenally better off and more interconnected and doing much better than they were doing, let's say, during the period between 1945 and 1975. Thank you.
Next question, please. Yes, Ambassador Zrani.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Elhan. Thank you, Madam Aisha. At least I can say I stand educated on most of the issues concerning climate. There's something which is agitating me with regard to our own country. Supposedly, our share in these climate change is less than 1%. And that statistics, I don't think we have gathered. It has been, we got it from outside. Now we are, in fact, lamenting that the world should do something about Pakistan. But here, my problem is that are we aware enough that what we have to do actually? If you look at the uncontrolled real estate business, which is the most lucrative business in this country, and which is also, in fact, contributing to whatever, climate problems we are facing, whether it is the cement industry, right from cement industry down to the sewage, and which we throw it to our river systems, and then it goes to our overall ecosystem. I wonder whether do we have some study on that, and can we actually implement such a study, or should we then, if we don't have, then we should launch one. So here I would, in fact, would like to be enlightened by both of you. Thank you.
I think one thing that we need to draw something of a distinction between is localized environmental pollution caused by various irresponsible uses of chemicals or other substances and inadequate facilities to treat the waste that is produced by industrial as well as consumption processes. Local environmental pollution is, of course, a very, very serious problem throughout the developing world. It is a problem which countries generally don't succeed that much in addressing because they don't have the resources or the organization to do it. At the Quaid-e-Azam University, since you mentioned if there are any specific studies, we actually have two very important research groups. One is led by one of our top environmental scientists, Dr. Abda Farooqi, and her study is basically about arsenic poisoning of the water table in Pakistan. So it's been published as a book abroad as well, and she has a whole arsenic research group, and they do try to engage with the government and raise awareness and other such things. We have a second research group on the impact of the sewage and other such things in terms of spreading antibiotic resistance in our microbial chains. That's led by Dr. Rabab Zehra, who is one of our top microbiologists. In fact, I think she's trying to win a prize right now for her research for a competition. And we also have people that are working on trying to develop, carbon capture techniques and other such things within Pakistan. So we do have people who are doing this good work, who are publishing their work in like very good quality journals. But that is academic work that does not really translate into any policy action or any policy response on part of the government to any other agency. So yes, we do have people that are engaged in it, and there are studies and books, etc., that Pakistani scholars are writing on these local challenges. But these local challenges are precisely that. They are local challenges, and they are things that we can actually do something about if the governments are inclined to help out local communities in terms of addressing these problems. The greenhouse gas emissions is another scale of a problem. So what is now happening is that because of global warming and global warming induced climate change, our underlying weakness in managing our local environments is coming under extraordinary pressure from the outside. So usse pehle we were not able to manage our, even day to day, like garbage collection ka haal dekh le in Islamabad, so many other examples we can give. So on top of that, now you have this almost metaphysical challenge that is coming in, and that is a challenge for which obviously we are not equipped to deal with, when we can't even handle the very localized challenges that are within our power to address. Thank you.
You've asked a very interesting question, and I think as a climatologist, it's a dilemma with me also. There is an essential deficit of capacity in our country. And I'll give you one or two very sorry examples where finance was available, but due to lack of capacity, we were not able to utilize. A few years back, the World Bank gave about 60 million to the Met Department to upscale its capability for forecasting. The Met Department returned that money, saying that they don't have the capacity to use it. A few years before that, the World Bank had again given $2 million to the government of Balochistan to improve certain systems under WASH, and they returned the money, saying they didn't return it. They sat on it for so long that the bank was forced to say that we will take it back if you don't use the money. We have not yet developed a single proposal for which we can access the Green Climate Fund. The two times that we have managed to develop, it has been outsourced. We've given it to the UNDP to develop the proposals, and the solutions that they come out with are not always the best solutions for our culture, our social conditions, or are people-centered. If you're developing something which can look very good on paper, but if it can't be implemented, it doesn't necessarily always work. The point that you've raised about, we are not causing, but we are suffering, yes, that is very true. And that is why we should have focused on adaptation. In the last 4 or 5 years, where we have the country started talking more about climate change, everything that we talk about is about mitigation, whereas that is not a bigger problem. Adaptation, before you can go into adaptation, you at least need a roadmap. So you need a national adaptation plan. We have still not prepared that. If you don't have one, how can you go to the conference of parties and say that you need anything between $7 to $14 billion annually for adaptation. You have not given a roadmap of how you are going. You have not addressed that issue in a way in which you have given them where you will use it, how you will use it, what will be the financial management systems for using such a large amount of money, where is the capacity. So these are issues that we have. And you've talked about policy, that we develop a policy. Unfortunately, I have to say that we have not, to my knowledge, implemented any policy. We developed the climate change policy in 2012, the implementation framework in 2013. We have updated the climate policy this year. We have a water policy. We have an energy policy. We have a food security policy. But please tell me, where are they being implemented? So if we have, institutional weakness and governance issues as a fundamental problem, no matter what policies we make, unfortunately, we will not move forward.
Ma'am. No, ma'am, please, you go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I think very interesting conversation and something that interests me absolutely. It is an existential issue for us. But I just would like to pose a very hypothetical question. And that is, for the time being, the metropolitans, the elites, and so on and so forth, are not really concerned about the plight of others who are suffering. But hypothetically, if the system collapses completely, and if the island countries disappear, where are these people going to go? What about migration and displacement and the others who are going to get affected very badly because of the ensuing, chaos? So I think it is in their interest also to see that something like this is averted, does not happen. But I think Ilhan's book is a very pessimistic assessment of the apathy of everyone. So I just want to know if somebody can enlighten me on
that. I think that when it comes to stopping migration from taking place, various crises, like let's say the civil war in Syria, give us a good idea of how the West would like to deal with any sort of large-scale migration. In the first instance, they would like to maybe pay somebody else to take the people and hold them for them and keep them there. And in the second instance, they would like to have a hard border regime and to basically repel or deter migrants from seeking to flee to Europe in this particular case, or indeed anywhere else. When it comes to small island nations, I don't really think that Western governments particularly care what happens to them. So if they sink, they sink. And that's tough luck for them. And of course, some might be evacuated in the event of that catastrophe or whatever. But it's their problem, not that of the Western governments. And that hardening, I think, is going to get worse with the passage of time. Because as climate instability increases, there will be more pressure in terms of people fleeing. And there is more pressure, then you will have greater pressure on Western governments to stop those people from coming in. The recent episode with Ukraine is also instructive in that there is a clear element of racial profiling, racial preference involved. So if people are fleeing a war in the Ukraine, they are generally being allowed to come into the European Union without too much of a hassle and being allowed to stay there. So I think that element is also something that we are likely going to see increase, that whatever sympathy there is will be basically directed towards people who are like the Europeans or like the Americans, and people like us or like people in the various Pacific Islands or other places who don't look like them, who have, different religions, different customs. As far as the West would be concerned, that, it's too bad. As like the Republicans always say after every mass shooting, they send thoughts and prayers, but that's about it. So I think that's what we can expect, thoughts and prayers. Yeah.
Human nature is a very important component, and when is at stake and the instinct for self-preservation takes over, everyone behaves, in their own self-interest. So it would not be unfair to think that the global north would not think of protecting itself first. So the question, yes, that is very likely. More right-wing governments coming up, very likely. An emotional and civilizational disconnect with us, also very true. All these factors will come into play. When you are fighting for your life, I think what will come back is the rule of the jungle and the right of the might. That is what's going to happen. Everyone, every country, and within the country, people will try to protect themselves first before they protect anyone. So I agree with Dr. Ilhan that, at the end of the day, we're all going to be left to our own resources. And the sooner we wake up to that reality and start doing something about helping ourselves, the better it will be for us.
Kumar, you had a question?
You can take the question from Komal and
Okay, sir.
Assalamualaikum. I'm the advocacy lead for Web3 here at IPRI. I actually have two questions. One of them is that are we leveraging technology enough to actually educate our own people in their languages and in a way to actually understand how their lifestyles are unhealthy towards the climate? Because given our average literacy rates and like the average amount of, awareness we have in people at large, I think climate change itself would sort of be a very abstract concept. And the second question is that a lot of our ancient civilizations disappeared without evidences of invasions, etc. So are we looking into the possibility of that potentially being climate change? And if we are, should we or are we researching into how it's, in the sense that if it was that bad that it wiped out entire cities so many years ago, should we be prepared for that situation or the reverse of it, just at a multifold potential?
Thank you, Dr. Ilan. My name is Ishtiaq Ali Makri. I have a very simple question, and at the very outset, to excuse if I sound a little traditionalist or conservative. You have very expressly talked about history, the evolution of history, the evolution of mankind, how societies go up and they come down. Is there any role of morality in all this? And would you like to throw light on it as an authority on history? What role can morality play in reshaping current history? Thank you so much.
Dr. Ilhan, if you could go first.
Sure. Right. Reference the question about leveraging technology to increase awareness. I think that the people who are responsible for most of the environmental damage are already the ones who are educated, mobile, and have a considerable amount of economic wealth. So the people who are subsistence farmers or people who are wage workers, they basically don't contribute so much to this problem, though they are disproportionately affected by the adverse consequences of climate change or even local ecological problems. So I think that is a fundamental problem that we face, and that is also a tragedy of this situation. And that is that it is precisely the people who are most aware who are not doing anything about it because of their privilege, because of their position in their respective societies. They have managed to convince themselves that, well, we will somehow continue to be immune to these problems. And, worst comes to the worst, yes, other people will suffer, but, we'll be all right. So I think that is a very, very sad situation. That is a situation that we are facing. Regarding older civilizational collapses, yes, there are instances of older civilizations collapsing because of environmental change. A very good example of this is the Indus Valley civilization. During the last 200 years or so of that civilization's existence, there was an acute period of drought in our part of the world. And that contributed greatly to the decline of its major cities, the disruption of its agricultural systems, and the ultimate collapse of that civilization. That drought cycle also affected other Bronze Age civilizations and contributed to their decline, in some cases collapse as well. But that process was something which took place over several centuries. And the people of, the Indus Valley civilization simply did not have the scientific knowledge or the understanding that, why is this happening to them? Our tragedy is that we do know why it is happening to us, and we're still refusing to do anything about it. So I would actually give them a pass on this and basically argue that, well, our understanding of the problem is many times greater. The other thing, of course, is that in the past, the fluctuations in the climate or the temperature was not actually that great. But because the underlying agricultural or social system was so fragile, it was easy to disrupt. In our context, what we have seen is that we are already close to +1 degree, +1.2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. And that rapid escalation in the climate, in the world's temperature, is truly unprecedented. So, I mean, that is something which nature or other such things simply cannot adapt to. Regarding the question on morality in history, I think that civilizations and empires like to imagine themselves as being moral. They like to imagine themselves as having some kind of moral or, spiritual legitimacy, as the case might be. But ultimately, civilizations are not about morality. They are about power and organization and strength. And you can organize civilizations on different moral systems that are completely antithetical to each other and have successful civilizations in terms of their power, organization, and strength. So morality as such might come into the equation when it comes to the behavior of a state towards its own people to an extent. That can certainly be a factor, or state morality, if you can call it. But it probably isn't much of a factor in history overall. Thank you.
Ms. Aisha, if you could share your views.
To add on to that, the first question about advocacy, I think the level of advocacy essentially depends on understanding what you're trying to advocate and your sensitivity to the subject. So that is lacking in our case, because in our education system, we are not teaching right from the beginning respect for the environment. Climate change is a different subject. It is a result of accumulated environmental degradation. So what we need to do perhaps is to frame the message in a different way. We should not use too much technical jargon to describe climate change, and we should stop talking about climate change as a subject, because it includes so many other sectors. So when things happen, for example, to the farmer at the agricultural level, we should then relate it to the changing climate. When there is out of season rainfall or snow, the media should actually play a role in highlighting how the climate is changing and how your activities are contributing. So I think repeated messaging over a period of time will build that sensibility. in the people. Without that, if you just put a message there, climate change, save the world, extinction, it's not going to make any difference. It doesn't register with people. So you have to relate it. Water shortage, why? Food security, why? Energy, why? So once you do it in simpler ways, I work with mountain communities myself, and essentially I am a practitioner who now engages in policy matters, but my heart still remains with the community and I learn from them. Every time I go, you sit, you engage, sustained interaction with them over a period of time helps them to understand because they really don't know. I mean, the global climate regime changing, big words, they're not going to relate to that. But after 20 years, my communities up north at least all know what is global warming, not so much, why it's happening, but they know it's happening, how it's going to affect them, how they need to build their own resilience. So it's a process which has to be maintained over a period of time. With regard to morality, I think I do agree with Dr. Ilhan Niaz that, morality is a changing concept. It is also anchored in vested interest. When it suits us to say something, we adopt a moral stance, but when it requires matching action, we fail because if it goes against our interest, it doesn't make sense for us anymore. If you talk about climate change and moral responsibility, the Paris Agreement is anchored in that. It is called a moral mandate. But has it made any difference? No. At the time of the Paris Agreement, the parts per million of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were 416. Today, they're 419. They're more than before. After all the NDCs coming from all the countries and all the high pledges and commitments and lofty declarations that countries make. So, saying something to sound good and politically correct is one thing. Actually doing it is quite another.
Any more question? Fazan?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. So my name is Fazan. I'm a researcher at IPRI. I have two questions. The first one relates to this argument which is made by historians like Harari that we're living in the age of confusion, when we see a collapse of a common story. So earlier that story used to be the neoliberal order, but that is also collapsing. And with the age of the rise of digital media, we do not have any common story. So do you think that is also one of the immediate threats that the world might be facing right now? And secondly, when it comes to climate, specifically in the West, we see a lot of guilt activism in which people tend to tell you that you personally are responsible for whatever is happening. So what do you think, who do you think is the primary actor who should be taking action? Is it a common person? Is it the multinational companies? Or is it the states and the politicians? Who is the primary actor or the main actor who should be taking action in this direction? Thank you so much.
And your question is towards Dr. Ilhan.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Alia Naqvi from CSCR. Also had the privilege to work on the editorial team of this book by Dr. Ilhan. My question is to Ms. Aisha. You know how in Pakistan, water, food, agriculture, and even environment are issues where provinces have the authority to pass governing legislation. So whereas climate is a federal issue. So do you see any work being done to address this disconnect in interprovincial coordination?
First.
When it comes to the fracturing of a common narrative or whatever, I think when we think about, let's say, post 1989, the contemporary narrative of globalization and free markets and liberal democracy, that was really a one-sided conversation. It was the product of the implosion of the Eastern Bloc, and a kind of a vacuum then prevailed. And in that vacuum, these ideas were thrown about and became normalized or accepted. But that did not necessarily mean that those ideas had genuinely produced some kind of a consensus that was held to beyond the narrow circle of elites in developing countries or the developed world. When it comes to digital media, I think over there the record is a little bit mixed, because when you think about how we communicate, whether it is through WhatsApp or through Facebook, these are the exemplars par excellence of neoliberal globalization. And the next frontier of that globalization is essentially data. And that data is owned by these very powerful global corporations. So I think it is very interesting that we are, in a way, all participating in helping Facebook and WhatsApp and Apple and all these other companies like Google get richer by simply having a digital footprint, even while we are using that digital footprint to maybe spread hatred of each other, to spread xenophobia of each other. And the more hatred or the more xenophobia we spread, the more we use these mechanisms of instant communication to spread them. So it is a kind of a toxic path dependency. And that toxic path dependency actually enriches the engines of digital globalization, even while they make the people who are using them think that, we're like, vive la résistance sort of thing, that, we're like fighting against it. But they're not fighting against it. They're basically being trained by the algorithm to increase their engagement with the software or the application. And the more time they spend in terms of user engagement, the application designers have realized is that you are more likely to spend time if you are angry or conflicted or confused than you are if you are in a peaceful or a rational or a inclusive frame of mind. So this is also paradoxical in a way, that the same process of digital globalization, corporate data mining, that is producing the fissuring of societies, is actually enhancing the power of that digital capital relative to the societies that are its victims. So I would argue that the mechanism of that narrative driven by profit has assumed a life of its own. And it helps us manufacture a illusion of diversity, and it fragments our societies, making us even more vulnerable to the profit taking by these companies. So it's a new phase of like globalization, and the narrative part, I don't think that was very seriously there, but definitely the profit taking part, that is now going into overdrive with the use of this digital media. Regarding guilt activism, I think over here, people in the global south or elites in the global south need to be a little bit careful about how they frame their accusations relative to Western countries historically responsible for global greenhouse gas emissions. The fact is that even in Western countries, the average person has not made the kind of heavy contribution that a handful of corporations or their own elites have made. So from a purely, political lens, from a pure mobilization lens, if there is to be a global environmental movement, that global environmental movement needs to be directed across national boundaries, and it needs to encourage people in the West who are waking up to the realization that the extractive behavior of their own elites and their system of economic organization are leading the planet to destruction. So we need to be a little bit, careful in that sense, that it's not a question of, all people in the West being equally responsible. There are some people in the West who are certainly very responsible, particularly the 70 to 100 big corporations. And that is where the responsibility needs to be fixed. Thank you.
I think with reference to your remark about whether we are living in the age of confusion, I would say perhaps we're living in an age of shrinking resources and a burgeoning population that is pitting vested interest groups against each other for grab of resources. And I think this is going to lead to societal strife and violent conflict eventually. So this is, the first thing. The other thing about name and shame, these kind of tactics work in the West because the idea is to get countries like the Friday movement or the Extinction Rebellion movement, etc., for those countries to reduce their emissions. For us, it really doesn't work because we haven't really thought of how to come up with a strong message to put pressure for adaptation, because mitigation, global warming is all about that. So we don't need to do that at our country level. Dr. Ilhan has talked about big data, and I think that is going to be very, very important because even our reason is influenced by our feelings. The feelings that are triggered then make us think along those lines. Diplomacy is a very important tool here. And if the definition in the presence of diplomats I dare to make is to get a buy-in for your narrative, then there has to be a convergence of that narrative for the home constituency as well as for the international community. Our biggest problem that I see is that we take on a completely different narrative to get traction from the home constituency, and our needs are quite different when we go to the international community. So that becomes a big problem that we need to address. With regard to the second question, again, I think very, very pertinent, because the Ministry of Climate Change can only sign and ratify international agreements. Its mandate doesn't extend to the provinces after the 18th Amendment. Now, conceptually, theoretically speaking, 18th Amendment devolution is a good idea, but again, we've done it too hastily without all the necessary preparations, strengthening of capacities, capabilities, to assign such big responsibilities to the provinces. And now we see big differences between the capacities of provinces. Take Punjab, take Balochistan, and you see it's very evident that capacities are different. Each province has also developed its own climate change policy. And they, because of the political fracturing in the country and the social polarization, are not willing to work with each other. Unfortunately, the Pakistan Climate Act that was passed in 2017 has still not been operationalized. And the main reason for that is, again, turf wars between the different ministries of not trying to institute and constitute an authority that can become the platform for bringing everyone on board. Because unless your provinces are with you, the center alone, I'm afraid, can't do very much. So I have always been a strong advocate that operationalize the Climate Act, set up that authority, provide that, platform where you bring the provinces on board and then plot your trajectory on your way forward.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, we'll conclude our Q&A session. I'd like to thank all the audience members for some really interesting questions and the speakers for equally interesting responses. I'd now like to request President IPRI, Ambassador Dr. Raza Mohammed, to please deliver his closing address.
Assalamu alaikum once again. I'll begin with the appreciation and gratitude for the panelists, for Dr. Ilhan, for Ms. Aisha, and our comms team who have actually managed this whole thing today. They selected a very good topic and very apt speakers. I must appreciate them all. And thank you so much. As Ambassador was saying, we gained new knowledge today. But one concern which comes to my mind with reference to Komal's question, we may not consider ourselves elite, maybe part of that, but we are blessed people sitting here, listening to all this, talking about this, discussing this. We speak in English. We mostly write our articles also in English newspapers and English. How would this whole message go down to the people who are really affected and who really actually contribute a lot to the dangers that climate faces now? That is an important question. I think we should be working on that, and maybe our comms team can, what we can do is that host some events on Twitter Space or somewhere, or webinars and all that, in kind of bilingual thing. It should be a kind of bilingual thing in which we speak English, Urdu, दोनों mix करके बोलने. अभी हमारे लोग उर्दू पढ़ लेते हैं वैसे इंग्लिश में लिखी हुई, वो जो रोमन उर्दू जिसे हम कहते थे किसी जमाने में, but it becomes sometimes difficult to send this message down. Morality, immigration, elite, बड़ी अच्छी बातें already हो गई. Morality is always relative. Just see the application of human rights, democracy, climate, and so many other things. Somewhere these are used as tools of coercion. Somewhere the people look other way, whether the country is democratic or not. You can have a look around. You can have a look only on the global south. Middle East में क्या होता है, यहाँ क्या होता है? तो आज तक कभी किसी ने कहा कि वहाँ पे जमहूरियत नहीं है, because their interest coincide. Ukraine की immigration की बात हुई, no doubt. Tomorrow, if this catastrophe happens in Afghanistan, even if mass exodus होता है, so who is going to take the millions of refugees or thousands of refugees from Afghanistan into Europe? No one will. They'll ask you to house them. जैसे डॉक्टर इल्हान ने कहा वो पैसे दे देंगे कि आप इनको रख लें. अच्छा, बड़ी interesting चीज I wanted to share. I hope you know when did the climate change started as a subject in the political science? When did it start? Any idea? Somewhere in 1972, 1974. Before that, it was none there. But the first lady which actually tried to awaken the world's conscious on this thing was Rachel Carson. She wrote a book, Silent Spring, and it was in 1962. She is an American lady, and she wrote the Silent Spring like a fiction. And she attracted the people's attention to the use of pesticide, especially the DDT, which was used very extensively in those times for killing of mosquitoes, for killing of flies and all that. And she actually studied and made people conscious of its harms, that the DDT and pesticides and their harmful chemicals could take to birds, fish, and the food. Initially, the industry, the American industry, stood against her. But ultimately, President Kennedy, he deputed a committee to study this thing. And she was actually honored with this thing, that she was right. And that is how it started off in 72 में आके फिर climatic subject आ गया. But what interesting thing I want to take you to is, especially citing Aisha Khan as an embodiment of that thing, that is ecofeminism. Ecofeminism का लफ्ज़ पहली दफा तो 74 में एक था DPO में, मार्कस डिबोने, जैक्विस डिबोने या फ्रांसिस डिबोने, उन्होंने ये कॉइन किया था. बट अल्टीमेटली इस पर बहुत लोगों ने काम किया, ग्रेटा गार्ड ने किया, बाकी लोगों ने किया. आजकल भी ग्रेटा है जो छोटे वाली, वो खड़ी है क्लाइमेट के लिए. So she talked of the concept of duality, nature and nature and woman, culture and man. He said man uses culture to exploit women, and man also exploits the ecology. So women are more suited to fight against the ecological degradation. तो इसलिए मैं कह रहा था कि ecofeminism की embodiment है मैम आयशा हमारे पास. Faith, hope, optimism, बड़ी अच्छी बातें हैं. I think अल्लाह ने जब हमें faith दिया, हमें create किया, तो अल्लाह ने हमें बहुत अच्छे तरीके से बता दिया कि अच्छा क्या है, बुरा क्या है. Then he gave the power to decide to man. So इसलिए ना अल्लाह को blame कर सकते हैं, ना ही कोई में छलांग लगा के कह सकते हैं कि मैं मरूंगा नहीं. So faith अपनी जगह पे, but अच्छे मेजर्स अपनी जगह पे जो हमें करने हैं अपनी कंट्री के लिए पहले और बाद में दूसरों को ब्लेम करने. Once again, thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I will now request President IPRI to please present memento to today's speaker and discussant. Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Ms. Aisha Khan.